47,000 people watched Carlos Mendez die. They watched him stumble. They watched him slur his words. They watched him ignore the hundreds of comments scrolling past. Comments begging him to turn around, to descend, to save his own life. And they watched the stream go black at 650 meters, 23 minutes after he first showed signs that his brain was swelling inside his skull. This is the complete story of the most watched death in mountaineering history, not the sanitized version, not the summary. The full, uncut investigation into how a 28-year-old Mexican YouTuber turned his Everest summit bid into content, and how that content became a snuff film witnessed by tens of thousands in real time. If you think you've heard this story before, you haven't. What's been reported barely scratches the surface. The deleted comments. The sponsor who knew. The final phone call that was never made public. The 23 minutes of footage that exists but has never been released. And the question that still haunts everyone who was watching that day. Could they have saved him? Carlos Mendez wasn't a reckless amateur. He wasn't an Instagram influencer playing mountaineer for clout. He was an experienced climber, with 5 years of high-altitude expeditions behind him. He'd summited Aconcagua twice. He'd reached the summit of Denali. He knew the risks. He understood altitude sickness. He had trained for this moment for 3 years. And none of it mattered. Because Carlos made one decision that overrode everything else he knew about survival. He decided that the content was more important than the climb. He decided that 47,000 live viewers were worth more than his own life. And by the time he realized his mistake, if he ever realized it at all, his brain had already begun to die. His body was found the next morning, less than 400 meters from where the stream cut out. He had collapsed face down in the snow, his phone still gripped in his frozen hand, battery dead, screen cracked from the fall. The Livestream app was still open. The last frame anyone saw was a blur of white, then static, then nothing. But here's what makes this story different from every other death on that mountain. 47,000 people could have stopped it. They tried. For 23 minutes, they screamed into the void. They typed warnings in Spanish, English, Portuguese, French. They tagged his girlfriend, his sponsors, his expedition company. They called emergency numbers that went nowhere. And Carlos, delirious, hypoxic, dying, smiled at the camera and said, "We're almost there, everyone. Stay with me." Those were his last words on record. If this is your first time on this channel, you need to understand something. We don't do summaries here. We don't do quick overviews. What you're about to hear is the deepest investigation into Carlos Mendez's death ever assembled. Interviews with his climbing partners. Analysis from altitude medicine specialists. Messages from viewers who were there that day and still carry the weight of what they witnessed. This is the full story. Every decision. Every mistake. Every moment that led to a man dying on a live stream while the world watched and could do nothing. Subscribe now if you want to go deep. Because this is just the beginning. Carlos was born in Guadalajara, Mexico in 1991. The youngest of 3 children in a middle-class family that valued education and stability. His father was an accountant. His mother worked in hospital administration. Neither of them understood why their son was obsessed with mountains. It started when Carlos was 15. A school trip to the volcanic peaks outside Mexico City, while the other students complained about the cold and the altitude, Carlos stood at the edge of a crater and felt something shift inside him. He later described it as the first time he felt completely awake. By the time he was 22, he had quit his engineering job and started a YouTube channel. The premise was simple. Document expeditions to increasingly dangerous peaks and bring viewers along for the ride. In an era of polished travel content and sponsored Instagram posts, Carlos offered something different. Raw footage. Honest struggle. The unglamorous reality of high-altitude climbing. The vomiting, the frostbite, the moments of genuine fear. His first video got 200 views. His 10th got 2,000. By the time he summited Denali in 2017, he had crossed 100,000 subscribers. Sponsors came calling. Gear companies. Energy drink brands. A major outdoor retailer offered him a 6-figure deal to wear their logo on every climb. But the deal came with conditions. Content quotas. engagement metrics, and, most critically, live streaming capabilities on major expeditions. The sponsors wanted real-time access. They wanted the drama of Summit Day delivered live to audiences around the world. They wanted Carlos to be their brand ambassador in the death zone. Literally, Carlos agreed. He always agreed. Because the truth that nobody wanted to talk about was this: Carlos was broke. Despite his subscriber count, despite his sponsorships, he was barely breaking even. Expeditions are expensive. Permits, gear, guides, insurance, flights. A single Everest attempt could cost upward of $70,000. Carlos funded his dreams through credit cards and sponsorship deals that looked impressive on paper, but often paid in gear credits rather than cash. He needed the live stream, not just for his sponsors, for himself. A successful Everest live stream could generate tens of thousands of dollars in super chats and donations. It could triple his subscriber count overnight. It could make him the most famous adventure YouTuber in Latin America. Or it could kill him. The people who loved Carlos saw the warning signs long before May 2019. His girlfriend Lucia Reyes would later tell investigators that Carlos had become obsessive about the Everest expedition. He wasn't sleeping, he was overtraining. He talked about the climb constantly, but never about what would happen after. It was like he couldn't see past the summit, Lucia said. Like everything else in his life had stopped existing. His older brother, Rodrigo, tried to intervene 3 weeks before Carlos left for Nepal. He drove to Carlos's apartment in Mexico City and found him packing equipment at 2 in the morning. I asked him why he was still awake, Rodrigo recalled. He said he couldn't afford to waste time. He had to check every piece of gear. He had to make sure the cameras were working. He had to test the satellite uplink. I asked him when he'd last eaten. He couldn't remember. Rodrigo begged his brother to postpone the expedition. Just 6 months. Get some rest. See a doctor about the insomnia. Carlos refused. He told me this was his moment, Rodrigo said. He said the sponsors were locked in, the permits were paid for, the window was coming. He said if he backed out now, he'd never get another chance. That wasn't true. Carlos was 28 years old. He had decades of climbing ahead of him. He could have taken a year off, recovered, and come back stronger. But content doesn't wait. Algorithms don't care about your mental health. And sponsors don't pay for expeditions that don't happen. So Carlos got on a plane to Kathmandu with 60 pounds of camera equipment, a satellite phone, a live streaming rig that could broadcast from above 8,000 meters, and a determination that had crossed the line into something darker. He would reach the summit. He would deliver the content. He would give his viewers the show of their lives. He just wouldn't survive it. If you're still here, you understand why this story matters. It's not just about one climber. It's about what happens when the pressure to perform becomes indistinguishable from the pressure to die. Subscribe now if you want to see the full investigation. Because the decisions Carlos made in Nepal, and the decisions made for him, are about to get much, much worse. Before we continue, I need to tell you something about the people who tried to save Carlos. Because this story has villains. Sponsors who pushed too hard. An expedition company that looked the other way. A platform that monetized a man's death and never faced consequences. But it also has heroes. People who saw what was happening and tried everything in their power to stop it. Lucia Reyes was one of them. She was watching the live stream from their apartment in Mexico City when Carlos first started showing symptoms. She recognized the signs immediately. The slurred speech, the confusion, the way he kept asking what time it was, even though there was a clock visible on his phone screen. She started calling everyone she could think of. The expedition company, the satellite phone provider, the emergency contacts Carlos had left with her. None of them answered. At the same time, a viewer named Diego Vargas was doing his own math. Diego was a medical student in Buenos Aires who had been following Carlos's channel for 2 years. He had watched dozens of climbing documentaries. He knew what haste looked like, and he knew that Carlos had, at most, an hour to descend before the swelling in his brain became fatal. Diego started typing. He posted comments every few seconds. He tagged Carlos's sponsors. He shared the stream link on every climbing forum he could find, begging anyone with a satellite phone to contact Basecamp. I knew he couldn't read the comments, Diego would later say. His eyes weren't tracking right. He was looking at the camera, but he wasn't seeing it. But I thought maybe someone else could get through. Maybe his expedition leader. Maybe another climber. Somebody. Nobody did. The 23 minutes between the first visible symptoms and the stream cutout are the most analyzed minutes in mountaineering livestream history. Researchers have gone frame by frame. Altitude medicine specialists have watched it dozens of times. And the consensus is unanimous. Carlos Mendez could have been saved. If he had descended at the first sign of confusion, just turned around and started walking downhill, he would have lived. The symptoms would have reversed within an hour. He would have lost his summit bid, but he would have walked off that mountain. But Carlos didn't descend. He kept climbing. He kept streaming. He kept performing for an audience that was begging him to stop. And by the time his brain swelling reached critical levels, he was physically incapable of making rational decisions. The very organ that could have saved him was the organ that was dying. This is the tragedy at the heart of this story. It wasn't a sudden avalanche. It wasn't a falling serac or a broken ladder. It was a slow-motion death, broadcast in real time, that anyone could see coming except the one person who needed to. What happened next, what we're about to cover in the remaining chapters, is the full investigation into every decision, every failure, and every person who bears responsibility for what happened on May 19, 2019. The expedition company that should have pulled him down. The sponsors who should have told him the content wasn't worth dying for. The platform that profited from his death and never changed a single policy. And Carlos himself, a man whose dreams became a trap he couldn't escape. Hit subscribe now, because this story is about to get much darker, and you need to understand every detail of what went wrong before you can understand why it keeps happening. Let's go back to the beginning, to the moment Carlos Mendez first decided that a camera was more important than a climbing partner. Chapter 2. Carlos Mendez, the man behind the camera. To understand how Carlos Mendez died, you first have to understand how he lived. And to understand how he lived, you have to understand the specific kind of loneliness that drives someone to broadcast their life to strangers. Carlos was never popular in school. He wasn't unpopular either. He was invisible. The kind of kid who sat in the middle of the classroom, earned middle grades, played middle positions on sports teams, and graduated without anyone remembering his name. His older siblings, Rodrigo and Maria, were the stars of the family. Rodrigo made valedictorian. Maria got a scholarship to study law in the United States. Carlos got a polite congratulations and a suggestion that he consider trade school. He never complained about it, his mother would later tell reporters, but I think it hurt him more than he let on. He wanted to be special. He wanted people to notice him. The mountains noticed him. That first school trip to the volcanic peaks changed something in Carlos that his family couldn't quite articulate. He came back quieter, more focused. He started reading climbing memoirs. He saved money from his part-time job to buy hiking boots. By the time he was 18, he had summited every major peak within driving distance of Guadalajara, usually alone. The solitude was the point. On the mountain, there was no competition with his siblings. No comparisons. No expectations. There was just the climb and the climber. For a young man who had spent his entire life feeling overlooked, the mountains offered something rare. Proof that he existed. But solitude doesn't pay bills. And it doesn't satisfy the hunger that Carlos carried with him everywhere. The need to be seen, to be acknowledged, to matter. YouTube solved both problems. Carlos started his channel in 2015. Filming his expeditions with a second-hand GoPro and editing the footage on a cracked laptop in his apartment. His early videos were rough, shaky camera work, poor audio, rambling narration. But there was something authentic about them that viewers responded to. Carlos wasn't performing for the camera. He was talking to it like a friend. I remember his third video, said Miguel Torres, an early subscriber who would later become a moderator in Carlos's online community. He was bivouacking on some small peak in Oaxaca, and he just started talking about his childhood, about feeling like nobody cared whether he existed. And I thought, I know exactly what this guy means. That's when I subscribed. By 2017, Carlos had built something real. A community of viewers who followed his expeditions, cheered his successes, and shared his disappointments. He started doing live Q&A sessions after climbs. He responded to comments personally. He remembered viewers, names, and asked about their lives. For the first time in his existence, Carlos Mendez was the center of attention. And the feeling was addictive. If you're watching this and you've ever created content, you understand what happened next. The algorithm rewards consistency. The sponsors demand growth. The audience expects escalation. A successful YouTuber can't just repeat the same content forever. They have to go bigger, higher, harder. Denali wasn't enough. Aconcagua wasn't enough. The sponsors wanted something that would break through the noise. Something that would trend. Something that would cement Carlos as the premier adventure YouTuber in Latin America. They wanted Everest. The expedition was announced in January 2019 with a slickly produced video that Carlos later admitted he hated making. Corporate graphics. Sponsor logos. A dramatic voiceover about conquering the world's highest peak. It was everything Carlos had spent years avoiding, the polished, manufactured content that he'd built his brand in opposition to. But the sponsors were paying, and the sponsors wanted spectacle. I tried to talk to him about it, said Lucia Reyes, his girlfriend of 3 years. I told him the video felt wrong. It didn't sound like him. He said he knew, but it didn't matter. He said once he was on the mountain, he could be himself again. The summit footage would be real. That was all that counted. Lucia paused during her interview. I should have pushed harder. I should have told him to cancel the whole thing. But I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe he knew what he was doing. Here's what Carlos didn't tell Lucia. What he didn't tell anyone until it was too late. The main sponsor, a major outdoor equipment company, had inserted a specific clause into their contract. Carlos was required to livestream the summit attempt, not just film it for later upload, broadcast it live in real time from the death zone. The technology to do this had only recently become reliable. Satellite uplinks capable of streaming HD video from above 8,000 meters were experimental at best, prohibitively expensive, and added significant weight to an already brutal climb. Most serious mountaineers considered them a dangerous distraction. Carlos accepted the clause without negotiation. He told me it would be fine, his brother Rodrigo recalled. He said he'd done live streams before. He said the technology had improved. He said he could handle it. What Carlos didn't say was that the live streaming equipment would add nearly 15 pounds to his summit day pack. He didn't say that managing the uplink would require him to stop frequently, extending his time in the death zone. He didn't say that splitting his attention between climbing and content creation in an environment where every decision could be fatal was a recipe for exactly the kind of disaster that happened. He didn't say it because he didn't want to admit it, and maybe, just maybe, because he didn't fully believe it himself. The training regimen Carlos undertook in the months before the expedition was punishing. He ran marathons at altitude. He climbed in hypoxic tents. He hired a nutritionist, a strength coach, and a sports psychologist. On paper, he was as prepared as any amateur climber could be. But the people closest to him saw cracks. His training partners reported that Carlos was pushing through injuries that should have sidelined him: a strained Achilles, chronic knee pain, a persistent cough that he blamed on allergies but never got checked. When his doctor suggested postponing the expedition for a full physical evaluation, Carlos fired him and found a new doctor who would sign off on the paperwork. He was running from something, Lugia said. I never figured out what. But the closer we got to the expedition, the less present he became. He was in the room with me, but his mind was already on the mountain. 2 weeks before his flight to Nepal, Carlos recorded a video that was never published. His brother Rodrigo found it on his laptop after his death. In it, Carlos sits in his apartment at night, the lights off, his face illuminated only by the screen. I don't know if I'm ready, he says to the camera. I keep telling everyone I am. I keep saying all the right things. But when I'm alone, like right now, I don't know. I don't know if I can do this. He pauses for a long moment. But I have to. Everyone's counting on me. The sponsors, the viewers, my family. If I back out now, what was any of this for? What's the point of everything I've built if I don't see it through? Another pause. I'll figure it out on the mountain. I always do. He reaches forward and stops the recording. That video was filmed on May 1st, 2019. 18 days later, Carlos Mendez would be dead. If you're finding this story as disturbing as I am, hit subscribe. Because the decisions Carlos made, and the decisions made for him, are about to lead us directly into the death zone. Here's what the sponsors never told Carlos. and what the expedition company should have warned him about. Live streaming from Everest isn't like streaming from sea level. The cold destroys battery life. The altitude makes electronics unpredictable. The physical demands of managing a broadcast while climbing above 8,000 meters create a cognitive load that has killed people. In 2018, just 1 year before Carlos's expedition, a French climber named Julien Marchand died on Makalu while attempting to live stream his summit bid. His body was found with his phone in his hand, the live streaming app still running. Analysis of his movements suggested he had stopped to adjust his camera equipment in an area where stopping was fatal. Julien's death was widely reported in the climbing community. Carlos almost certainly knew about it, but he never mentioned it publicly, and his sponsors never acknowledged the parallel. They had a product to sell, and Carlos was the product. The expedition company, meanwhile, was more concerned with logistics than safety protocols. They provided Carlos with the standard briefings on altitude sickness, weather windows, and summit timing. They assigned him a climbing Sherpa named Mingma Dorje, one of the most experienced guides on the mountain. They filed the permits, managed the camps, and did everything by the book. What they didn't do was question the live streaming plan. "It wasn't our place," the expedition leader would later say in a deposition. Mr. Mendez was an experienced climber. He had his own sponsors, his own equipment, his own agenda. We provided the support he contracted for. What he did with his cameras was his business. This was technically true. It was also a catastrophic failure of judgment. Mingma Dorje, the Sherpa assigned to Carlos, saw what was coming. He had guided dozens of expeditions. He knew the signs of a climber who was taking on too much. But when he tried to raise concerns, he was told to focus on his job. "I said the camera equipment was too heavy," Mingma would later tell investigators. "I said he was moving slower than he should. I said he was distracted. They told me it was a sponsored climb. They told me the cameras were non-negotiable." Mingma shook his head. "I should have refused to climb with him, but I needed the work. I have a family, so I said nothing more." On May 18, 2019, Carlos Mendez left Camp 4 at 11:15 p.m. with Mingma and 2 other climbers bound for the summit. His satellite uplink was active. His phone was fully charged. His followers had been notified that the stream would begin when he reached the balcony, roughly 3 hours from the summit. At 4:20 a.m. on May 19th, the live stream began. 47,000 people tuned in to watch Carlos Mendez climb toward the top of the world. They had no idea they were about to watch him die. Subscribe now if you haven't already, because what happened in the next 5 hours is the most documented death in mountaineering history, and you need to see every frame to understand what went wrong. Chapter 3. The Fatal Decision. Content over Survival. The first 3 hours of the live stream were everything Carlos had promised his sponsors. Clear skies, stable footage, a climber in apparent good health, moving steadily toward the summit of the world's highest peak. At 4:20 a.m. Nepal time, when Carlos activated the satellite uplink, he had approximately 14,000 viewers. By 5:30 a.m., that number had doubled. By the time he reached the south summit at 6:45 a.m., 47,000 people were watching live. The comments were ecstatic. Viewers from Mexico, Spain, Argentina, Colombia, and a dozen other countries typed congratulations and encouragement. The Super Chat donations started flowing, $5, $20, $100 at a time. Carlos's sponsors were thrilled. The outdoor equipment company was already drafting press releases. The energy drink brand was preparing social media posts. Everything was going according to plan. And then, at 7:12 a.m., something changed. If you watch the archived footage, which still exists on various corners of the internet, despite attempts to scrub it, you can see the exact moment things start to go wrong. Carlos stops moving. He's at approximately 8,600 meters, just below the Hillary Step. He turns to the camera and says something, but his words are slurred. The audio quality on the stream was never great. Satellite bandwidth limitations meant the sound cut in and out, but viewers who were paying attention heard it. We're making... What time is it?" He had asked what time it was twice in the previous 10 minutes. "Both times," Mingma had told him. Both times, Carlos had looked confused by the answer. Diego Vargas, the medical student in Buenos Aires, was one of the first to notice. "I typed a comment immediately," Diego said in his interview. "I said, 'Carlos, "You're showing signs of AC. You need to descend N and now." I posted it 3 times in a row. I don't know if he saw it. He didn't. The comments were scrolling too fast. Thousands of viewers were typing at once, and Carlos's eyes weren't tracking the screen properly anymore. He was looking at the camera, but his gaze was unfocused, distant. High-altitude cerebral edema, HACE, is one of the most dangerous conditions a climber can face. It occurs when low oxygen and altitude cause fluid to leak into the brain, creating swelling that disrupts cognitive function. Early symptoms include confusion, loss of coordination, and poor judgment. Advanced symptoms include hallucinations, paralysis, and coma. The only treatment is immediate descent. For every hour spent at altitude after symptoms begin, the chances of survival decrease dramatically. The brain is dying, and unlike frostbitten fingers or exhausted muscles, brain tissue doesn't regenerate. Carlos should have known this. He had trained for this. He had read the literature. He had probably seen the symptoms in other climbers during previous expeditions. But HACE has a cruel irony built into its pathology. The part of the brain that recognizes danger is often the first part to be affected. By the time a climber is symptomatic, they've already lost the judgment necessary to save themselves. They don't realize they're dying. They feel fine. Better than fine. Sometimes. The oxygen deprivation can create a sense of euphoria, a feeling that everything is going perfectly even as their brain bleeds into itself. Carlos felt fine. "We're almost there," he said to the camera at 7:18 a.m. "Just a little bit more. Stay with me, everyone." His voice was steadier now, not because he was recovering, but because he had stopped trying to process complex thoughts. He was operating on autopilot. The part of his brain that managed basic motor functions was still working. The part that could recognize danger, weigh consequences, and make life-saving decisions was shutting down. Behind him, Mingma was watching with growing alarm. "I could see he was not right," Mingma would later tell investigators. "He was walking different. His feet were not hitting the ground correctly. I called to him, 'Carlos G, we should rest. We should check oxygen.' But he kept going." Mingma faced a terrible choice. If he physically stopped Carlos and forced him to descend, he would be defying a paying client and potentially ending the expedition. The sponsors would be furious. The expedition company would lose money. Mingma might lose future work. But if he let Carlos continue, the man might die. On Everest, this calculation happens more often than anyone wants to admit. The commercial model of modern mountaineering creates perverse incentives. Sherpas are paid to get clients to the summit. They're not paid to make difficult medical judgment calls. They're not trained in altitude psychiatry. And they're certainly not empowered to overrule a climber's decisions, especially when sponsors and cameras are involved. Mingma made the choice that thousands of guides before him have made. He followed the client. "I told myself he would recognize the symptoms," Mingma said. "I told myself he would turn around when he realized. I stayed close to him. I watched. I thought there was still time. There wasn't." What happened next is captured on the live stream in fragmentary, haunting detail. At 7:25 a.m., Carlos stopped to adjust his oxygen mask. This should have been a routine check. Summit climbers do it constantly. But Carlos couldn't seem to figure out the straps. He pulled at them, twisted them, pulled again. Finally, he gave up and left the mask hanging loosely on his face. "Having some trouble with the gear," he said to the camera, smiling. "No big deal. We're good." "We're so good." The comments exploded. "Carlos, your mask isn't on right. Fix the mask, bro. Someone tell him. At Ming Midoriya, fix his mask. This doesn't look right. Is anyone else worried?" Diego Vargas was typing as fast as he could. "He has HACE. Someone call base camp. Call emergency services. He is going to die if he doesn't descend." Lucia Reyes was watching from Mexico City. She saw the comments. She saw her boyfriend's glazed expression. She started making phone calls. First, she called the expedition company's emergency line. No answer. Then, she called the satellite phone number Carlos had left with her. It went straight to voicemail. Then she called Carlos's lead sponsor. A junior marketing associate answered and said he'd, quote, Pass along the message. I was screaming at them, Lucia said. I was telling them my boyfriend was dying on a live stream. They told me to calm down. They said Carlos knew what he was doing. They said they'd have someone look into it. They didn't look into it. At 7:31 a.m., Carlos resumed climbing. He was moving slower now, much slower. The stream showed him taking 3 or 4 breaths between each step. His oxygen mask was still loose. Frost was forming on his eyebrows and around his mouth. But he was still moving toward the summit. I thought about closing the stream, Lucia said. I thought maybe if the viewers went away he would stop performing, he would come back to himself. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't look away. And neither could anyone else. 47,000 witnesses. And not one of them could reach through the screen and pull Carlos Mendez back from the edge. If you're watching this and wondering how something like this could happen, how a man could die on camera while thousands of people screamed warnings he couldn't hear, the answer is simpler and more disturbing than you might expect. He trusted the content more than he trusted himself. Carlos had built his entire career on the premise that the camera revealed truth. He believed that broadcasting his life made him accountable, authentic, real. He believed that the audience would catch what he missed. But the audience couldn't save him. They could only watch. And Carlos couldn't hear them anymore. At 7:38 a.m., he turned to face the camera one more time. His eyes were glassy. His speech was almost unintelligible. The stream audio crackled with interference. Thank you all for being here with me. This is... He trailed off. He stared at something beyond the lens, or maybe at nothing at all. Then, he turned back toward the summit and kept climbing. The comments were no longer celebratory. This is wrong. Someone needs to stop this. Is anyone reporting this? At YouTube, this stream needs to be shut down. He's dying. We're watching a man die. Subscribe now if you want to understand what happened next. Because the final 23 minutes of Carlos Mendez's life are the most analyzed minutes in live streaming history. And they contain secrets that the sponsors, the expedition company, and the platform all desperately wanted to bury. Chapter 4. The Catastrophe, 47,000 Witnesses to Death. The timestamp reads 7:52 a.m. Carlos Mendez is standing still. He hasn't moved in nearly 4 minutes. The camera, mounted on a chest harness, shows a view of blinding white snow and a pale blue sky. His breathing is audible, shallow, irregular, rattling. Behind him, barely visible in the frame, Mingma Dorje is shouting something, but the wind distorts his words into noise. 47,000 people are watching. The comments have shifted from alarm to despair. Viewers who had been typing urgent warnings are now posting prayers. Some are crying. Some are calling emergency numbers in their home countries, hoping someone, anyone, can coordinate a rescue. A few have already left, unable to watch any longer. But most stay. Most can't look away. What happened in the next 23 minutes has been reconstructed from the live-stream footage, survivor interviews, expedition logs, and the report filed by the Nepali government's Mountain Rescue Division. Each source tells a slightly different story, but the essential facts are not in dispute. At 7:54 a.m., Carlos began walking again, not toward the summit. Sideways, perpendicular to the fixed ropes that marked the route. He was drifting off course. Mingma ran after him, grabbed his arm, tried to redirect him. Carlos shrugged off the grip and kept moving. He was very strong, Mingma said. Even when his mind was gone, his body was strong. I could not hold him. At 7:58 a.m., Carlos stopped again. He sat down in the snow, removed his gloves, and began examining his hands as if he'd never seen them before. The stream showed his bare fingers, pale, already showing signs of frostbite, flexing slowly in the thin air. In the comments, someone posted, "This is Hayes. His brain is swelling. He has maybe 30 minutes before total incapacitation." That comment was later verified as coming from an emergency medicine physician in Madrid who was watching the stream between shifts. He was wrong about the timeline. Carlos had less than 20 minutes. At 8:02 a.m., Mingma made a decision that he would later describe as the hardest of his life. He unclipped from the fixed rope, moved to Carlos's side, and physically tried to lift him to his feet. I told him, Carlos G. We go down now. Summit doesn't matter. We go down, Mingma recalled. He looked at me and smiled. He said, we're so close. Then he patted my shoulder like I was a child. Like I didn't understand. Carlos stood on his own. For a moment, it seemed like he might follow Mingma's instructions. He turned in the direction of the descent route. He took one step, then two, and then he turned back toward the summit. I can't leave now, he said to the camera. His voice was almost unrecognizable, thick, slurred, punctuated by long pauses between words. Everyone's watching. I can't let them down. He was dying because he couldn't disappoint an audience that would have done anything to save him. At 8:07 a.m., Carlos attempted to adjust the camera angle. His movements were clumsy, uncoordinated. The stream went briefly sideways, showing nothing but white snow and gray rock. When it stabilized, Carlos was on his knees. He stayed on his knees for 3 minutes. The stream showed him swaying slightly, his head drooping forward, his breathing more labored than ever. Mingma was visible behind him now, speaking urgently into a radio. Later analysis of the expedition's communication logs revealed what Mingma was saying. Client is not responsive. I repeat, client is not responsive. He cannot descend on his own. I need immediate support. Send backup to the Hillary Step. Base camp's response was garbled but discernible. Understood. Backup en route. ETA, 45 minutes. 45 minutes was too long. Everyone on that mountain knew it. But the nearest climbing team was at the south summit, and they had their own clients to manage, their own oxygen supplies to conserve. Nobody was going to abandon their expedition to rescue a stranger. That's the reality of commercial climbing that nobody wants to talk about. When death comes, you're alone. At 8:12 a.m., Carlos spoke his final coherent words on the live stream. He looked directly into the camera. His eyes were unfocused, but something flickered there. A moment of clarity, perhaps, or just a final reflex. His cracked lips moved slowly. Tell Lucia I'm sorry. Then he fell forward into the snow. The camera angle shifted as he collapsed. The view rotated 90 degrees, showing sky where there should have been mountain, cloud where there should have been rock. Carlos's face was briefly visible, pale, eyes half closed, frost crystallizing on his eyelashes. He wasn't moving. The comments became a wall of grief. No. Someone help him, please. At Lucia_Reyes, I'm so sorry. Is he dead? He's not dead. He just fell. Get up, Carlos. Get up. But Carlos didn't get up. For the next 11 minutes, the live stream continued broadcasting. The camera showed nothing but snow and the edge of Carlos's shoulder. His breathing was audible, a wet, rattling sound that viewers would later describe as the most disturbing thing they'd ever heard. Every few seconds, a small puff of vapor appeared where his mouth met the snow. He was still alive. Barely. At 8:19 a.m., Mingma appeared in the frame. He rolled Carlos onto his back, checked his pulse, and began performing what appeared to be chest compressions. Whether this was medically appropriate at 28,000 feet, with both men on supplemental oxygen, is something that altitude medicine specialists still debate. But Mingma was trying. He was doing everything he knew how to do. It wasn't enough. At 8:23 a.m., the stream quality deteriorated suddenly. The video became pixelated, breaking into blocks of color that no longer resembled anything identifiable. The audio cut to static. Viewers who were still watching saw one final frame before the feed died completely. Mingma's face, close to the camera, his expression a mixture of terror and grief. Then nothing. The stream ended at 8:24 a.m. Nepal time. Carlos Mendez was officially declared dead 5 hours later when a recovery team reached his body at the location where he had fallen. The cause of death was listed as high-altitude cerebral edema complicated by hypothermia. He was 28 years old. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened after the stream went black is just as disturbing as what happened before. If you've made it this far, you understand that this isn't just a story about one man's death. It's a story about systems. The systems that pushed Carlos toward this moment. The systems that failed to save him. and the systems that scrambled to protect themselves once he was gone. Subscribe now, because what the sponsors did next, what the expedition company tried to hide, what the platform refused to acknowledge, is the part of this story that they never wanted you to hear. In the hours after Carlos's death, while his body still lay on the mountain, the machinery of damage control was already spinning. His lead sponsor's social media team drafted a statement expressing deep condolences, while explicitly declining to discuss the contract that required live streaming. The expedition company's legal department began reviewing liability waivers. YouTube's trust and safety team received hundreds of reports about the stream but took no action, allowing archived versions to circulate for days before quietly removing them. And Lucia Reyes, who had watched her boyfriend die while screaming into phones that no one answered, received a call from a PR firm asking if she would be willing to sign a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a settlement package. She refused. "They wanted to make this go away," Lucia said. "They wanted to pay me to stop talking. I told them no. I told them the world needed to know what they did to Carlos. What they did to Carlos is the subject of the next chapter. But first, I need you to understand the scale of what was being concealed." Carlos's sponsors had received warnings about the risks of high-altitude live streaming months before the expedition. Internal emails, later obtained through legal discovery, showed that their own risk assessment team had flagged the climb as potentially problematic and recommended requiring backup communication protocols and a qualified expedition physician. Those recommendations were never implemented. The expedition company had been informed by Mingma Dorje that Carlos was carrying too much camera equipment and moving too slowly during acclimatization rotations. Their response was to suggest that Mingma encouraged the client to optimize his packing without providing any specific guidance or support. And YouTube's platform, which had monetized Carlos's final moments through advertisements that played before and during the stream, had no policy in place for emergency intervention during live broadcasts of potential medical crises. Every system that could have saved Carlos Mendez failed. And after he died, every system worked overtime to make sure nobody was held accountable. This is what happened after the stream went black. Chapter 5, Aftermath. When the stream went black, the first call came at 4:17 a.m. Mexico City time. Lucia Reyes had been watching the stream for hours, unable to sleep, unable to look away. When the feed cut to static, she felt something collapse inside her. She didn't know if Carlos was dead. She didn't know if the signal had simply failed. She only knew that she was 8,000 miles away from the man she loved, and she couldn't reach him. The call was from a number she didn't recognize. A woman's voice, professional and flat, introduced herself as a representative of the expedition company. "Ms. Reyes, I'm calling to inform you that there's been an incident involving Mr. Mendez on the mountain." Lucia already knew, but hearing the words made it real. "Is he alive?" A pause. Too long. "At this time, Mr. Mendez is unresponsive. A recovery team is en route. We'll contact you as soon as we have more information." Unresponsive is the word they used. Not dead. Not dying. Unresponsive. Lucia would later learn that Carlos had stopped breathing approximately 10 minutes after the stream ended. Mingma had continued CPR until his own oxygen ran critically low, then was forced to descend or die himself. Carlos's body was left at 650 meters, anchored to a rock to prevent it from sliding down the mountain. He would stay there for 14 hours before a team could reach him. In that time, the world learned what had happened. The first news reports appeared within an hour of the stream's end. "YouTuber dies on Everest livestream" was the headline. The story went viral almost instantly. Clips of Carlos's final moments, the slurred speech, the collapse, Mingma's desperate intervention, circulated on social media despite attempts to remove them. By the time the sun rose in Mexico City, Carlos Mendez was the most famous dead man in the world. What happened next was a collision between grief and commerce, between truth and reputation management. The expedition company released a carefully worded statement at 8 a.m. Kathmandu time. It expressed sympathy for Mr. Mendez's family and praised the heroic efforts of their Sherpa team. It did not mention the live streaming contract. It did not mention the warnings they had received about Carlos's equipment load. It did not mention that their emergency response protocols had failed at every stage. The sponsor statement came 2 hours later. Nearly identical language. Deeply saddened. Thoughts and prayers. Committed to supporting the Mendez family. No acknowledgement of the contract clause that had required the fatal broadcast. No acknowledgement of the internal emails questioning the plan. No acknowledgement of responsibility. YouTube said nothing for 3 days. When they finally spoke, it was through a boilerplate statement about community guidelines and ongoing review of policies related to live content. They did not address the advertisements that had played during Carlos's final moments. They did not address the fact that the platform had profited from his death. They did not address the hundreds of reports from viewers who had tried to flag the stream as a medical emergency. Meanwhile, Lucia Reyes was fielding calls from reporters, lawyers, and complete strangers who had watched her boyfriend die. "I didn't know what to do," she said. "People were sending me condolences. People were sending me hate mail. Someone sent me a clip of Carlos collapsing and asked me to comment on it. I was still waiting to hear if they'd recovered his body." The recovery happened on May 20, 2019, at approximately 6 a.m. local time. A team of 4 experienced high-altitude Sherpas reached Carlos's position after an overnight climb from Camp 4. They found him exactly where Mingma had left him, anchored to a rock, face up, frost covering his features. His eyes were open. His phone was still in his hand. The team photographed the scene, standard procedure for fatality documentation. Then they began the slow, dangerous process of moving the body to a point where helicopter evacuation would be possible. But here's what the expedition company never mentioned in their official report. When the Sherpas checked Carlos's phone, it still had power. The cold had slowed the battery drain. The live streaming app was still open, frozen on its final frame. And in the app's local storage, they found something that had never been broadcast. 23 minutes of additional footage. The satellite uplink had failed at 8:24 a.m., cutting the live stream. But the phone's camera had continued recording to local storage for another 23 minutes, until the battery finally died. This footage has never been released publicly, but investigators reviewed it. Lucia Reyes was offered the chance to view it. She declined. And based on the descriptions provided in legal depositions, we know what it contains. For the first 12 minutes, the phone lay on its side in the snow, camera pointing at an angle across Carlos's chest. His breathing is visible. The slow rise and fall of his jacket, the occasional twitch of his fingers. He was alive. He was conscious, at least intermittently, and he was alone. Mingma had descended, forced to choose between his own survival and staying with a man who was beyond saving. At approximately minute 14, Carlos's hand moves into the frame. He reaches toward the phone. His movements are slow, uncoordinated, but deliberate. He was trying to do something. Maybe turn off the camera. Maybe record a final message. Maybe just touch something familiar in his final moments. He never reaches the phone. His hand falls back to his chest. For the remaining 9 minutes, nothing moves except the snow drifting across the lens. The final frame, captured at 8:47 a.m. Nepal time, shows Carlos Mendez's face. His eyes are closed. His expression is peaceful. He looks like he might be sleeping. He had been dead for approximately 6 minutes when the battery died. If you're still watching, if you're still here after everything you've learned, then you understand why this story matters. Carlos Mendez didn't have to die. At every stage, there were opportunities to intervene. At every stage, the people with the power to help chose not to. The sponsors who required the live stream. The expedition company that ignored the warnings. The platform that monetized his death and changed nothing. And the 47,000 viewers who watched him die in real time, screaming into a void that nobody could hear. Subscribe now if you want to understand what came next. Because the investigation into Carlos's death revealed truths that everyone involved had tried to bury. And those truths are more disturbing than anything you've heard so far. Chapter 6. Hidden Truths. What they never wanted you to know. In the weeks following Carlos Mendez's death, his family began asking questions. Simple questions at first. What were the exact circumstances of the death? Why hadn't the expedition company responded to emergency calls? Why had the sponsors not mentioned the live streaming requirement in their public statements? The answers they received were evasive. The expedition company's lawyers insisted that all safety protocols had been followed. The sponsors' PR team deflected questions about the contract. YouTube cited ongoing internal review and declined to provide specific information about their response, or lack thereof, during the stream. Lucia Reyes was not satisfied with these answers. Neither was Carlos's brother, Rodrigo. They hired a lawyer. What followed was an 18-month investigation that would eventually produce over 4,000 pages of documents, internal emails, and depositions. The findings were never released publicly. The case was settled out of court with a non-disclosure agreement that bound all parties to silence, but some details leaked. And the picture they painted was damning. The first revelation concerned the live streaming contract. Carlos's sponsors had required him to broadcast his summit attempt as a condition of their financial support. This was known. What wasn't known until emails emerged during discovery was that the contract contained no provisions for emergency termination. There was no clause allowing Carlos to end the stream for medical reasons. There was no clause requiring sponsor representatives to monitor the broadcast for signs of distress. There was no clause mandating backup communication in case the satellite link failed. The contract was designed to maximize content value. Safety was an afterthought. One email, dated February 2019, showed a sponsor executive responding to a query from the expedition company about emergency protocols. "We trust that Mr. Mendez and his team will handle any medical situations according to standard mountaineering practice. Our role is to support the content creation aspect of the expedition, not to manage on-mountain logistics." Standard mountaineering practice. As if dying on camera was a normal hazard to be accepted. The second revelation concerned the expedition company's internal communications. 3 weeks before the summit attempt, Mingma Dorje had sent a written report to the expedition leadership expressing concern about Carlos's preparation. The report noted that Carlos was carrying significantly more weight than other clients, moving slower during acclimatization, and showing signs of sleep deprivation. Mingma recommended either reducing the camera equipment or delaying the summit bid until Carlos was better rested. The expedition company's response, delivered by email the same day: "Thank you for your observations. Clients' equipment choices are per sponsor agreement. Please continue to support client stated objectives." They knew that Carlos was compromised. They knew that the equipment was a problem. And they chose not to intervene, because doing so would have disrupted the sponsorship arrangement. The third revelation was perhaps the most disturbing. During Carlos's final hours on the mountain, multiple viewers had attempted to contact YouTube's trust and safety team to report a medical emergency in progress. The platform received over 300 reports flagging the stream between 7:30 and 8:24 a.m. Nepal time. None of these reports were acted upon. According to documents obtained during the investigation, YouTube's live content moderation team was operating at reduced capacity that weekend. The reports were logged but not reviewed in real time. By the time a human moderator actually watched the flagged content, Carlos had been dead for over 4 hours. YouTube's terms of service at the time included provisions for removing content that depicted real-world violence or death, but there were no provisions for emergency intervention during live broadcasts. There was no hotline. There was no rapid response protocol. There was no way for concerned viewers to trigger an immediate review. 47,000 people watched a man die. 300 of them tried to sound the alarm. And the platform's response was a cue that nobody was monitoring. These revelations emerged slowly over the course of the investigation. Each one added weight to a case that the defendants desperately wanted to settle before it reached a courtroom. In September 2020, a confidential agreement was reached. The terms were never disclosed. Lucia Reyes and the Mendez family received an undisclosed sum. In exchange, they agreed to stop pursuing legal action and to refrain from making public statements about the investigation's findings. The sponsors resumed their marketing campaigns within months. The expedition company continued operating without any significant changes to their protocols. YouTube updated their live content policies, but only after additional incidents forced their hand. And Carlos Mendez remained on the mountain. His body was never recovered. The cost of extraction, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, requiring multiple helicopter flights and extreme altitude recovery teams, was deemed prohibitive. His family was offered the choice between leaving him in place or paying for a recovery that could have bankrupted them. They chose to leave him. Today, Carlos Mendez's body lies at approximately 8,600 meters on the southeast ridge of Everest. Climbers passing his location on summit day sometimes report seeing a frozen figure off the main route. half buried in snow, still wearing the chest harness that held his camera. He became what climbers grimly call a landmark, one of the more than 200 bodies that remain on the mountain, too high to retrieve, too frozen to decay. Permanent monuments to the price of summit fever. If you've made it this far, if you're still with me after everything, then you understand that this story isn't really about Carlos Mendez. It's about us. It's about a culture that demands content at any cost. It's about platforms that profit from tragedy and face no consequences. It's about viewers who watch and comment and share, believing that engagement is the same thing as action. Carlos Mendez died performing for an audience, and we were that audience. Subscribe now if you want to hear the final chapter, because the question that haunts everyone who watched that stream, the question that still doesn't have a satisfying answer, is simple. Could we have saved him? And if not us, then who? Chapter 7. Legacy: The Price of Going Viral. 3 years after Carlos Mendez's death, a documentary filmmaker named Elena Rios traveled to Guadalajara to interview his family. She expected to find people defined by grief. Instead, she found something more complicated. Rodrigo Mendez had become an advocate for climbing safety reform. He testified before regulatory bodies. He gave interviews to outdoor publications. He pushed for legislation that would require expedition companies to carry enhanced insurance and implement stricter medical monitoring protocols. Most of his proposals went nowhere. The climbing industry is global, fragmented, and resistant to regulation. The money involved, millions of dollars flowing through Kathmandu each spring, makes comprehensive reform nearly impossible. But Rodrigo kept pushing. Carlos died for content, he told Elena. The least I can do is make sure his death becomes content that matters. That teaches something. That changes something. Whether anything has changed is debatable. In the years since Carlos's death, live streaming from extreme environments has only grown more common. Influencers broadcast from active volcanoes. Adventurers go live during base jumps and free solo climbs. The technology has improved, making high-quality remote broadcasts easier than ever. And people keep dying. In 2021, a Russian climber died on K2 while attempting to broadcast his summit. His stream was watched by 12,000 people. The circumstances were remarkably similar to Carlos's hazy symptoms, ignored warnings, a phone gripped in frozen hands. In 2022, an American influencer died in a rockfall accident in Patagonia while streaming a climb for her followers. Her final footage showed the boulder that killed her entering the frame from above. In 2023, a British adventure athlete drowned during a cave diving expedition that he was broadcasting on multiple platforms simultaneously. 23,000 viewers watched him swim into a passage he would never exit. Each time, the same pattern emerges. Brief shock, viral clips, statements of condolence from sponsors, and then nothing. No policy changes, no industry reforms, no meaningful consequences for the platforms and companies that profit from the content. The machine keeps grinding. If you're watching this and wondering what you can do, what any of us can do, the answer is uncomfortable. We're part of the problem. Every view, every share, every comment drives the algorithm that rewards risk. We click on thumbnails that promise danger. We subscribe to channels that push boundaries. We watch streams that might end in disaster. And when they do, we watch the replays. Carlos Mendez died performing for an audience. And his death taught the algorithm that death performs well. The clips from his final stream were viewed over 40 million times in the weeks after his death. They spawned reaction videos, analysis videos, memorial videos. His subscriber count, which had been around 300,000 at the time of his death, surged past 2 million within a month. He became more famous dead than he ever was alive. This is the obscene mathematics of attention economy. Carlos's death was not a tragedy to the algorithm. It was a success. It generated engagement. It drove traffic. It proved that the ultimate content, the content that cannot be faked or manufactured, is a human being dying in front of witnesses. The platforms know this. The sponsors know this. And they've done the math. If occasional deaths drive massive engagement, then occasional deaths are acceptable. The cost of doing business. The price of going viral. Carlos Mendez paid that price. And until the incentives change, others will pay it too. But here's what I want you to take from this story. Carlos Mendez was not a cautionary tale. He was a person. He was a kid who felt invisible until he found the mountains. He was a young man who built a community of followers who genuinely cared about him. He was someone's brother, someone's son, someone's boyfriend. He made mistakes. He trusted systems that failed him. He believed in the power of his audience until that belief killed him. But he was also brave. He climbed mountains that most people will never see, except in photographs. He shared his fears and his failures with strangers who became friends. He lived more in 28 years than many people live in twice that time. When we reduce Carlos to the YouTuber who died on Everest, we're doing exactly what the algorithm wants. We're turning him into content, stripping away his humanity, making him safe to consume and forget. He was more than that. They're all more than that. Every climber who dies on camera, every adventurer whose final moments become viral clips, every human being whose death entertains millions. They were people first, and they deserved better than to become content. So what do we do with that? I'm not going to pretend there's a simple answer. The systems that killed Carlos Mendez are larger than any individual, larger than sponsors, larger than platforms, larger than the climbing industry. They're embedded in the way we relate to each other through screens. They're part of the attention economy that shapes everything we see and share. But we're not powerless. We can choose what we watch. We can choose what we share. We can choose to see the human beings behind the thumbnails instead of just the content they produce. We can subscribe to channels that value substance over spectacle, that tell complete stories instead of chasing clicks.